Hello, thank you for joining today's webinar on the 2017 State of Authentication Report by Javelin Strategy Research. We're joined today by Pascual and Brett McDowell. Al is the Senior Vice President and Research Director at Javelin Strategy Research. He's an accomplished industry analyst, market researcher, and financial industry practitioner. Al is also the lead author of the 2017 State of Authentication Report. Brett McDowell is the Executive Director of the Fido Alliance, the organization he helped to establish in 2012 to remove the world's dependency on passwords through open standards for strong authentication. He has extensive experience in industry standards development and online authentication. Today's webinar will be recorded and available along with the slides on the fidoalliance.org website. If you have not yet downloaded the full 2017 State of Authentication Report, you can do so directly from the handout section of the GoToWebinar client or on the Fido Alliance website. The GoToWebinar client is also where you can enter your questions for our presenters. Questions will be answered at the conclusion of the webinar. And now I'd like to introduce Brett McDowell.
Thank you, Bree, and thank you everyone for joining us today and those listening to the recording after the fact. I want to start by saying why we at the Fido Alliance are interested in the State of Authentication Report, which you're going to learn all about today, and why we felt it was important to start measuring authentication. And we're in fact sponsors of this report, developed independently by Javelin. An old adage in business is you tend to get what you measure, and we didn't find any reliable measurements of really what are people doing around authentication and strong authentication. So we're very excited to support this effort, and it's something that we plan to continue to support year over year so that we can track the progress of high assurance authentication ecosystem. With that being said, I'm going to start with giving a very basic introduction to the Fido Alliance in case there's anyone here with us today or listening to the recording who is coming to this with fresh eyes. Let's start with the problem space. So the Fido Alliance was formed being one of the individuals involved in the formation. I can say that we felt that authentication was the biggest problem in information security. And here are some of the reasons why. These are recent headlines. We formed this alliance back in circa 2012, announced it in early 2013, to basically fix the world's password problem. And as you can see, there's a lot of evidence for the password problem having gotten worse year over year. I'm going to go through some of that data with you. We're at the point where billions of stolen credentials barely make headlines anymore. That's just how bad we are. It's past the tipping point, in my opinion. So over 80% of all data breaches can be and have been studied and attributed to weak default and stolen passwords. There's been an incredible increase in phishing attacks. Phishing is not novel or new, so it really struck me when I saw a 65% increase in phishing attacks year over year from 2015 to 2016. That means that people are really profiting from phishing attacks, perhaps more than ever before. And then lastly, we're breaking records every year. From 2016, over 1,000 data breaches just in the US, an increase of 40% over 2015. And it's only getting worse. We're going to be breaking that record again this year. So the Fido Alliance is a nonprofit collaboration of companies from around the world dedicated to solving this problem by developing standards for interoperable strong authentication that are designed to be ubiquitous as the password itself, because only something that has that strategic reach is a viable candidate to supplant the world's dependency on passwords. Passwords are a problem because they are so vulnerable to inexpensive and effective attacks, like phishing attacks and replay attacks after a data breach. So every data breach makes it easier to perform more data breaches. It's a vicious cycle, and that's why we are where we are. And it's not going to stop until we move the world off of, which means shared secret credentials like passwords and even one-time passcodes. So as you can see, we're looking here at the current board of directors. In addition to the board, we have a bunch of sponsor and associate members and liaison partners across various vertical markets, all working together on a common goal internationally to standardize FIDO authentication. One of the things I'd point out is that the participants here represent not only key vertical markets of consumer-facing services like e-commerce and payment, but also the companies that build our internet-connected devices, our PCs and our smartphones and our wearables, and also the companies that build the capabilities deep inside those devices, like the chipsets, the secure elements, not only from modern devices, but also traditional identity credentials, such as smart cards. They're all collaborating in the FIDO Alliance to solve this problem. And the mission is to produce not only something that's stronger and better security. I mean, as an industry, we've gathered together and we've done that before. The one-time passcode was an improvement over the password because it's not vulnerable to a replay attack after the fact. It doesn't sit around in a database to be used long-term the way a password does, but it's increasingly phishable in real time, and so that characteristic doesn't hold a lot of security value anymore. So not only did we set out to design something that would have fundamentally new security properties over shared secrets, but also this time we knew we had better make it a better user experience, or we're going to continue to see very disappointing opt-in rates for this new authentication technology. We were founded by companies who offer one-time passcodes as an optional second factor. And so we were familiar with just how few users like to opt into that service or stick with it even after they've tried it, because the user experience is worse. It's nothing worse than having to type a password than having to type 2 passwords. One of them is about to expire on you. So we knew from the get-go that we're going to have to design this around usability. So what we ended up doing is relying on public key cryptography to defeat the vulnerabilities of shared secrets. So everything is a cryptographic proof of possession, and you're going to hear a little bit more about why that characteristic in particular is now being recognized widely as the differentiator between strong auth and high assurance strong auth. But also we were going to rely on whatever the usability best practices would be. So FIDO creates an abstraction in the standard where you can plug in any kind of user verification technique you want. If users love 4-digit PIN codes, then you can use a 4-digit PIN code. If users love fingerprint, you can use fingerprint, face recognition, etc., and so on. So that's the way FIDO works. We leave the user verification innovation up to the industry, and it is a vibrant industry right now with a ton of innovation, a lot of startups breaking new ground every month in that industry, and it all just works with FIDO. Here's some examples of companies that have already taken advantage of FIDO standards. We are early in the adoption curve of FIDO authentication. And one of the things you're looking for in the early part of the curve are marquee brands that are bringing it to market at scale. So pleased to point out a few of these. So Google and Facebook in particular have done a lot with bringing FIDO in as a replacement for that second factor authenticator. Companies like ING and PayPal, NTT Docomo in Japan, Bank of America, have been using FIDO with an embedded biometric authenticator as a password replacement strategy. And there are many other examples from around the world. Here we've got banks from Korea and Japan featured, the UK government, and the leading payment network in Korea. So we're off to a strong start, as well as examples in enterprise with Salesforce and Dropbox, and retail with eBay. So here's another kind of metric, if you will, of the adoption curve right now with Fido Ecosystem. This shows how the products that implement Fido have been coming to market since April of 2015. When we first launched the Fido certification program, which tests products to make sure they conform to the standard and they interoperate with each other in the wild. So it's a two-part test, and then you are able to use one of these certification logos, either UAF for that multi-factor embedded sensor use case, or U2F for that security key OTP replacement second factor use case. So as you can see, there are a lot of products continue to come into market, nearly 400 now in the market. And a lot of these are kind of enabler technologies or devices. So you'd expect to see a big number. But if you are looking for a server-side solution to enable your service, recommend that you go to the Certified Product Showcase and look for servers. And you'll see that you can shop around, but there is a handful, it's not an overwhelming number, of certified servers that will help you enable your solution. And last but not least, I want to kind of tee up Al here for what he's going to go through. This is data stolen from his report, the report we're all here to hear more about today, which shows the state of adoption of strong authentication in general, right? So here we have over 50% of the companies that were surveyed still relying on only passwords. I think this might even be just within the enterprise, believe it or not. 25% using passwords plus an OTP. However, that's often an optional OTP, whether it's SMS delivery or otherwise. And only 5% of doing what this report identifies as the true best practice, which is high assurance strong authentication. And to tee that up, I'm going to quote Al, and then you can hear from him directly in just a minute. But I really like this point that he made in the report. It's time to set a new yardstick with which to measure strong authentication methods with the strongest deemed high assurance. In other words, not all strong authentication is created equal. We all know that strong authentication means 2 factors or more of a what you are, what you have, or what you know. And I really like the point that is tied more tightly to reality than theory, which is some of those factors are now highly vulnerable, while others, like a cryptographic proof of possession, are highly resistant to attack, especially attacks at scale. And with that, happy to turn this over to Al to tell you all about it. Al?
Thanks, Brett. I appreciate you didn't steal too much of my thunder. We have plenty to share still. I just wanted to also thank the team over at Fido Alliance, Brett especially, for sponsoring this research. Given what Brett shared and what we all know, I think it's the perfect time for us to be having this conversation. So before we get too much into it, I just wanted to briefly touch on the agenda for the remainder of the webinar. We're going to start by going into how we conducted the research. So we're going to cover the methodology here today. We're going to talk a bit about strong auth and then dive into the results, right? But first, let's talk about how we came to our conclusions, where we started from, what was the base. So Javelin went out and we conducted a survey of businesses. So we spoke to 200 businesses that were authenticating their customers either through online or mobile channels. And then we also spoke to 200 businesses that have enterprise authentication in place, right? So that's going to be the basis of the data you see. Now, we also spoke to a number of executives in a few different industries to pull together some case studies. Now, you're not going to see those in today's presentation, but we do definitely encourage everyone to pick up a copy of the report, and you'll get to hear and see more in that report about how companies like Google, for example, are approaching this issue, right? And of course, this is Javelin's research. We conduct our own independent research. You'll definitely appreciate the support of the Fido team, but this is all us, right? So if you have any questions, certainly always happy to answer them. So let's go ahead and move to the next slide. So an important point, and before we talk about the difference between traditional strong auth and high assurance strong auth, a really important point to make, right? When thinking about authentication, it's not just passwords where we have a problem. And in fact, pretty much any factor of authentication has a vulnerability. Now, we do recognize that some are inherently more vulnerable today, right? So, all the big password breaches definitely help to emphasize that point. But the fact of the matter is, every type of authentication technology has some degree of vulnerability. And you can see some of those here. You see some of the technologies here. Certainly, there are more technologies, more vulnerabilities, but it's a point worth making before we get into the difference between traditional and high assurance. So on the next slide, we'll dive into that difference. So we went out first when starting our research to try to understand what was or what is strong authentication. How is it being defined? The challenge we had was that no matter where we looked, there was no official definition of strong authentication. Those two words together. We found a number of variations, and at the end of the day, it seemed like every variation we found, right? Every organization we found talking about some variation of strong authentication, whether it was the FFIEC, PCI DSS, PSD2, NIST, they all included a general reference to multi-factor. So with two or more factors. And the idea, right, is that if one factor is compromised, there is a second supplemental factor. And so if you think about knowledge factor authentication, if a criminal can go out and steal passwords, the argument, I think it's a sound one, is that they are just as likely to be able to go out and steal other things that can be written down, be known. So you introduce this second factor, which is very inherently different, and it needs to be compromised in a different way. So now you're layering those two, and you're raising the degree of difficulty for the criminal. The challenge here is that criminals have gotten so good at compromising knowledge factors, and they are showing that they have prowess to compromise some of the other factors, right? And so, we have to question whether or not this traditional notion of strong authentication really fits the nomenclature. Is it strong, right? By that measure, by putting up a high bar, right? That's how we think about strong. Is it a high bar for individuals who aren't supposed to have access the system, right? It didn't feel like a high bar to us. So we took a step back and looked out at the market and tried to figure out, what are the alternatives? And now there are a number of ways to skin this cat, but ultimately the conclusion we came to was you need to reduce the risk of these factors being spoofed, right? Can we introduce that into the notion of strong authentication? So the conclusion or the notion that we came up with was this idea of high assurance strong authentication. So what do we mean by high assurance? So we are still talking about multiple factors, but at least one of those factors has to use public key cryptography. And so that could include the use of something like a smart card or a security key, layered with another factor. Now, you have something like a Fido enabled biometric authenticator. You're going to use that biometric to prove possession, right? So you are leveraging those two different factors, but ultimately you have, that public key cryptography underpinning, which is, very, very difficult to compromise and spoof with another factor layered on top. That feels much stronger in today's environment. We're not seeing compromises of these kinds of technology, right? So that's why we call it high assurance strong authentication. And that's what we went out to look for. We wanted to see, who was using traditional strong auth, who was using high assurance strong auth, and who was protecting systems with weak authentication, and what were the implications. All right, so enough on the definition. Now into the data. So it's unsurprising here, I think, right? So what we're looking at is the adoption of authentication technologies within the enterprise. It is unsurprising that more advanced forms, generally, of authentication are less adopted, right? So you think about biometrics or security keys, they kind of fell to the bottom of the list. Makes sense, right? I mean, that's generally what we see, what we know. They're newer, but at the same time, you look at that bar at the top. It's every business that is authenticating is going to be authenticating with at least a password, but predominantly a password, right? And so when you think about where we are with breaches and with phishing, and with the fact that we as individuals, I can ask for a show of hands right now, and I think you should all feel free to raise your hands because I can't see you, but if you reuse your password, you should raise your hand. And I would imagine most attendees on the line today are raising their hands. We reuse passwords, whether, as our own, for our own consumer applications or in the enterprise or across. Criminals are taking advantage of that. And that is the first stop, right? In fact, the only stop for many businesses when they're authenticating their employees. So we're going to dive into where and how these are being used, which I think is going to give you a much better impression on the next slide of the total risk that we're talking about here. So we wanted to understand when thinking about weak authentication, traditional strong authentication, and high assurance strong authentication, where were these being applied, right? Where were these being made available? So in the businesses, or among the businesses we spoke to, we asked, do you use these different systems? Do you have these different systems? And among those who had those different systems, we broke down the availability and use of different degrees, ultimately, of authentication, right? Is it weak authentication that you're using, i.e. the password? Is it traditional strong auth or multi-factor? Now, just because you're offering it doesn't mean it's always being used, but do you make it available for use there, right? Generally, you should be using it. And then high assurance strong authentication, are you using that for these systems? And I mean, you really start to look at some of these different systems and you look at the responses. I mean, first and foremost, what you're seeing is, in better than half the cases across all the systems listed here, they're being protected only with the password within the enterprise, right? So, I mean, if you really think about it, what that means is, their data, right? The data that belongs to the enterprise. We're talking about IP, financial information, sensitive company documents, but also consumer data, right? A lot of these businesses are serving consumers or even, serving other businesses. All of that data, right? Among half the businesses or better listed here are only being protected with a password. That is all, right? And that's what's standing between, criminals and insiders, who are looking to commit a crime and that sensitive information. Now, there are some encouraging numbers here, and you start looking at traditional and even it's strong for some applications. But I mean, you look at things where we have internet-facing applications, right? So think about a VPN or a corporate email portal, some web portal where you're doing work, something in the cloud, right? That can be accessed from the internet. I mean, these are some of the highest risk systems, right? I mean, you think about the requirements for for PCI DSS, for example, right? We have to have more than a single factor protecting any kind of remote access. It makes sense. I mean, this is the way in for a lot of criminals. And in fact, it reminds me of a story from the recent Black Hat conference, where they asked attendees, what is the most difficult control for you to overcome? And at the top of the list was multi-factor, right? And we barely have a third of businesses across the board here using that form of strong authentication, that traditional form of strong authentication to protect their systems, including ones that are internet facing. So I think we have a long way to go when it comes to enterprises protecting their own data and our data within the enterprise with better authentication, for sure. So what's driving the choice, right? Why do businesses decide that a password is the best way to go and that I don't need anything better? Well, if you kind of break down the most important attributes, right, and you start looking at the list, it becomes pretty apparent what the drivers are, right? It's making it easy, right? So is it easy to integrate? Is it easy to use? What does it cost? Is it cheap? Is it free? Is it low cost? I mean, that's going to drive or affect the thinking of folks within the enterprise, because we don't have unlimited budgets. And in fact, our budgets are rarely our own. We tend to have to go out to other people, hands out and ask for the money and build a case. It's a lot easier to get what you want if it doesn't cost a lot. But really, I mean, at the end of the day, what this is saying is cheap and easy, right? What enterprises are looking for first and foremost when it comes to authentication is cheap and easy. And what is cheaper or easier than a password? There's not much out there, really, that is, right? At the end of the day, it is very cheap. It is very easy. And in fact of the matter is that is costing us, right? So cheap and easy is protecting your personal information at financial institutions, healthcare providers, technology companies. Cheap and easy is protecting intellectual property, and financial information. And we all know that criminals are targeting that information as well, right? In corporate espionage, we're trying to get rich, using companies' financial information. It's all cheap and easy. So that's the enterprise piece, right? And actually, we shared this. I think we shared this a couple weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, over at Money 2020. Now I get to dive into some of the consumer side, which we didn't talk too much about at that event, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity. Now, fortunately, what we see when you kind of look between businesses that, or at least respondents that were authenticating the customer versus authenticating, internally, is that while high assurance strong authentication adoption is generally the same, traditional strong authentication is higher, right? It is not the best option. I don't know if we even want to go as far as saying it is really strong authentication anymore, but the fact of the matter is that adoption is at least higher. We'll talk about why that is. It does make sense, but we would love to see that dark bar move further to the left, and I'm hoping that as we track this over time, it really does. So on the next slide, this is the breakdown of the availability of different authentication technologies, and what we see is that the higher rate of multi-factor authentication within consumer applications is actually driven by two factors, right? Maybe I should put that another way. It's driven by two things. I shouldn't say two factors within the context of this webinar. It's driven by two things, right? The first is that OTP, one-time codes, are much more pervasive within the consumer space or the customer-facing authentication space, right? And I mean, that's one of the challenges that we face, or that I have faced in engaging with clients. After the NIST announcement on the deprecation of one-time passwords, I had clients come out of the woodwork saying, what do we do? Adoption is, it was really picking up. We've got people trained, they know how to use it, they don't resist it. This is, this is supposed to be a panacea for us. And now we need to unwind, we need to find alternatives. The fact of the matter is one-time passwords are pretty pervasive. And so that's, contributed to a higher rate of multi-factor authentication being available for customers. The other factor here too is that we see multi-factor being made available not only on the online channel, but also in the mobile channel, quite frequently, and everyone has an app, right? So traditional multi-factor is being driven also by things like regulation, right? In financial services, for example, for high-risk transactions. But it's being driven by a number of, different items, right? Or different underlying drivers. But at the end of the day, the top solution is always going to be, and still is, not always, hopefully, but still is knowledge factors, right? So passwords, static KVA, dynamic KVA, right? And that's not good for protecting our accounts in any way, shape, or form when information is being compromised hand over fist, right? So let's move to the next slide. Similarly, we broke things down by industry. And what we saw kind of made sense, right? When you think about it, healthcare, financial services, the most significant adopters of traditional strong authentication, not necessarily high assurance, but traditional. This is an industry that has a lot of very sensitive information to protect. It is pretty well regulated. Now, there's another way to look at this. We could always dive into. We don't have it shared here, but the different types of solutions that underpin it. I'd imagine for healthcare and finance, it's going to look a little different than some of the other industries. But what was really encouraging was the information and technology responses, especially around high assurance strong authentication, right? 12%. This, again, it makes sense. And these are industries that are generally ahead of the curve, certainly when it comes to technology, and they are making these forms of technology available to their customers. Now, this is not to say that everyone's using it. And, the fact of the matter is, I think it's going to take a while before we're all trained, right, as consumers, to think this is what I need to do, to have this technology in our hands, more broadly, right? We're just starting to roll out, these technologies and making them available in limited channels, but, at least the companies themselves are adopting it and making it available. And that is a very, very big deal. So in the next slide, and this is very similar to what we saw, or a similar kind of way of looking at things as we did with the enterprise respondents. What we wanted to try to understand was, between industries, when thinking about how they authenticated customers, what were the top drivers, right? Was it, the accuracy or in essence, the efficacy, right, of the solution? Is it how it affected loyalty of customers? Is it accessibility, right? Because not every solution is as easily accessible for different customers. So think about disabilities or age being a consideration. Was it cost savings, regulatory requirements, flexibility, or friction, right? What was really interesting was that customer loyalty, right? The idea that you want to provide something that really kind of drives the customer to feel good about doing business with you. That was generally a top choice. Now, for healthcare and finance, accuracy was number one, and I get that. But having the customer feel good, right, driving the perception, right, of that consumer, affecting that perception to make them feel safe, make them want to come back and do business, that was really, really compelling. And I think with something like a high assurance, strong authentication, you could achieve multiple things, right? You can provide something that is highly accurate. You can provide something that feels strong to the customer. And there's even flexibility in how in the types of technologies you use to address things like accessibility. So you can really get to a lot of these considerations, address a lot of these considerations for the customer, using some of the high authentication or the high assurance, strong authentication solutions that are out on the market today, right? And so that's a positive, right? It's less about cheap and easy. It's more about being accurate and making the customer feel good. And so fortunately, that really aligns well with a lot of high assurance, strong authentication. So what do you do, right? I mean, how do you, or when do you leverage high assurance, strong authentication? Well, number one, if you are in a position, and we have a lot of data actually in the report, we didn't cover it today, around data breaches. But if you are in a position where you have experienced a breach, you're going to be looking at everything that you do to protect your data, protect your accounts, protect your customers, protect the enterprise. And if you want to bolster confidence and actually do what you need to do to prevent another similar event, high assurance strong authentication is going to be something that fits really well within your remediation plan, right? Whether you are a massive Fortune 100 or a small medium-sized enterprise, there are opportunities to leverage high assurance strong authentication, and at the end of the day, reduce your risk. And in fact, you look at the Verizon report, one of the top drivers of breaches, is weak authentication, right? So it makes absolute sense that you would apply high assurance after a breach. Now, if you want to win customers, right? What can you do? You can affect their perception of how secure you are. We saw that certainly with customers or with businesses that authenticating customers, that they want to drive that perception. And in fact, even with partners, right? Showing that you are leveraging something that is highly secure, right? That's high assurance, should bolster their perception of your security. And for a lot of businesses, that can be a differentiator. When you have new products or new services, or generally new types of businesses that hit the market, there's always a rush to get the product out, right? To talk about how the product or service is special, and how consumers or businesses need that, right? And there's less of an emphasis on security until one of your competitors or a competitor, or player says, these other solutions are great, these other providers are great, but we're safe, and they're not safe. So let us do for you what they do, but let's do it safely. And so something like high assurance strong authentication is a way to deliver that message, right? To act as a differentiator. And then within the enterprise, if there is any solution, any system that is internet facing, that is an absolutely perfect place for high assurance strong authentication, right? That is where criminals are going to be targeting. It is one of the weakest points, generally, within the enterprise. And so perfect spot for high assurance. And if you have any places where you're storing sensitive data, right? Data that would be of significant value for insiders. So whether that is sensitive personal information belonging to consumers, whether again that's intellectual property, or just systems that if there was unauthorized access could place a risk to the operations of the business, those are also going to be places where you want to have high assurance, strong authentication. There are a number, by the way, of additional recommendations within the report. So if you pick up a copy, and I encourage you to do so, you'll find another several recommendations there as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Brett and the Fido team to move into some questions.
Great, thank you, Al. So yes, we have been receiving questions, and it looks like we've got a healthy amount of time to go into them. So here's, let's just start here. So question about comment, it's probably one that I made about, let's see, navigating this. Oh, okay, so this first one's for you, Al. So this is kind of about your methodology. Is a data set of only 400 companies truly representative of the entire industry? What size were the companies? Where are they located? Which industries, et cetera? What more can you say about your data set? Al, you might be muted.
Oh, yes, I was muted, thank you. And that's a lot to answer, actually. So what I would say is that 200 businesses is a pretty healthy, 200 businesses broken down by customer and by enterprise is a pretty healthy sample. Now, though I think it is more or less representative, I guess it depends on the size of the industry. But what we're talking about when we do the industry breakdowns are among the survey sample respondents, right? Now we shoot for we shoot to be above a floor when we start breaking down segments, and generally that floor is, I believe, 40 respondents per segment, and so. And that's generally how we approach it. Now, if we were to do something like an overall sizing or some kind of forecast, then we would want, I think, more sample to be sure. But from a methodology perspective, we're talking about the respondents here.
Okay, thank you, Al. So the next one, because I didn't say this, it must have been something that you mentioned as you worked your way through. This is about, what has been talked a lot about in the press, first, especially when 863.3 first came out. When you say NIST has deprecated OTP, what do you mean? And it goes on, the question goes on to say, that maybe NIST has deprecated OTP via SMS, or has they actually deprecated TOTP, where you're getting the one-time code off of an app like Google Authenticator, et cetera.
Right, and so that's a good point. So initially, the interpretation of the draft guidance was that they were referring to all text-based, right, OTP. And there was a clarification after the fact that they were primarily talking about SMS OTP via VoIP. So there was a bit of a backtrack, and so you'll find that it was kind of like it was a supplementary blog post / note for clarification. And so, I actually found my blog, I leaned on them pretty hard for that. But at the end of the day, they probably could have been a little more clear, because I could tell you it caused a lot of frustration among our clients.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. And by VoIP, you kind of mean SMS, right? The SMS channel. And all right. So here we go. And this is more. It's the Al show. So one of the slides in the presentation shows companies like Google, Facebook, et cetera, supporting the use of FIDO on their sites. To what extent is their lack of making FIDO authentication visible on their login pages hindering the adoption of FIDO? So is my slide talking about some of the big brands that have already deployed FIDO solutions, but the question's directed to you, Al. What are your thoughts about the reality today that most of those web pages, web applications, and even the native applications that are using FIDO, actually even more true with the native applications, they don't mention that they're using FIDO to the consumer. FIDO's not on the login page, for example. What are your thoughts about that, vis-a-vis the recommendations in your report around high assurance, strong authentication, and kind of getting the word out?
Yeah, so I think it makes sense to message to consumers, to customers more broadly, that you are doing things to better protect their accounts. The challenge becomes making them aware of the value of the things you're doing. And so I'd imagine over time that as Fido becomes more of a consumer brand, right, a brand that consumers generally understand represents a strong form of authentication, strong security, that mentioning that to customers right up front is going to be something that helps to drive adoption. Until that point, and businesses are going to need to go through a little bit more effort to educate, but at the same time, they should be taking advantage of it. Certainly just because of the fact that so much information that they already rely on those businesses to authenticate customers that customers generally use when they're not using, Fido has been compromised. Right? You want to transition them. It makes perfect sense. You protect yourselves, you protect your customers. It's just going to take a little more work, I think, in the beginning to get them to understand what Fido is about. But they definitely should. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Al. So I'm going to paraphrase this question. This is essentially pointing out, I think this is probably aimed at me. So U2F items, what hard tokens, generally referred to as security keys, you have to be carried around, right? It's a hard token. It's one more thing that you're going to carry as a user. And there are examples, pre-existing examples, like an RSA OTP token, that are here. The questioner is positioning as high friction. So the point of the question is, why ask employees to carry yet another piece of plastic, right? This is an enterprise use case. Why ask the employees to carry around something else? They already have to carry around their OTP generator. And the hint here also goes on to say, where does the smartphone fit in for authentication in the enterprise, especially something around proximity or Bluetooth? So I'll take a shot at it, and Al, if you want to add, feel free. So the notion of a security key, differentiator between a security key and the traditional OTP hard token in the enterprise, is that a lot of times, so for the enterprise use case, maybe you only need one hard token. If you're doing a lot of B2B, you might end up with the token necklace, lots of tokens, because you have to log into your supply chain's portals with a hard token. But the model is really hard token per app or per portal. So you can often get away with it just one in an enterprise case for your own enterprise portal. So why would you add something else? Well, a design feature in Fido U2F and the security key model is that one key can be your second factor for an unlimited number of applications and portals. So that's one answer to the question, why move to security key, or why add security key? Because over time, as adoption increases in the enterprise on the server side, more and more portals will support Fido standards, and therefore you can do more and more with less hardware with one security key. And then you can use that same security key at home when you're authenticating into your personal services as more and more personal sites adopt it and the web browsers implement it, and so on and so forth. So virtuous cycle there in terms of getting more and more value over time for that one easy to use, easy to carry security key, which is probably two, by the way. Best practices, at least if you follow Google's lead, is to use two, one for backup and one with you. Now, to go into where does the smartphone fit in? Fido authentication also treats an embedded authenticator as a full Fido authenticator. So you can get true multi-factor authentication, not only with sort of a more traditional view of it, where you're typing in a password and then you're using a hard token as a second factor. With Fido, you can do that with an embedded biometric, for example. So the fingerprint sensor that's unlocking your phone, or the facial recognition that's unlocking your phone, is also the user verification authentication factor number one that gives the embedded Fido authenticator on your smartphone the permission to then sign authentication challenges using public key cryptography, which makes it high assurance and also makes it two-factor high assurance authentication. So from an application perspective, when you're FIDO enabling your infrastructure as a service, as a website, then what you're really doing is you're implementing the ability to use either form factors, smartphones, embedded authenticators. Recently, Intel's made some news, putting embedded FIDO authenticators into devices such as the PCs from Lenovo and the fingerprint sensors that are there, as well as U2F that's embedded into the PC. So we're seeing kind of equal interest, a lot of interest on both sides, I'll say, of embedded embedded authenticators into modern devices, as well as those second factors. So don't think FIDO just means, second factor and security key, or that any of these recommendations for enterprise or consumer market are inherently hard token recommendations, because that same technology that makes something high assurance is present in the embedded authenticators as well. Anything to add to that, Al?
No, I think you answered it pretty completely, Brett.
So where do you see high assurance authentication being adapted the most, by region or country? So I'm going to give that one to you, Al, to start with.
Well, so that's tough. I mean, Brett, I say that because and just knowing what the FIDO Alliance has done, you have made a lot of traction in certain markets, right? Like South Korea or Japan. And so I think if we start talking about how high assurance strong authentication aligns with what FIDO's offering, it would seem like those markets are going to have a bit of a head start for sure. But that being said, we know that North American markets, or even markets in Western Europe especially, are suffering from the same kind of challenges that we are, to the same degree, around breaches of sensitive and personal information and credentials. And it seems like those markets have probably the most distinct need, or the most immediate need, for stronger authentication to be in use. And so I mean, wherever there's need, and that drives demand. So I think it's going to be, I think we're going to see really strong adoption in North America and in Western Europe. But what we really need to is for some of these businesses to start adopting and start making it available, and really start educating people on the value of it. But it's going to enjoy some strong growth for sure, because the breach environment's not going to change, and we're just going to continue to hear more stories about the need for something better.
Got it. Thanks, Al. Yeah, I guess what I would add is some places where we're seeing adoption first. Again, I won't answer it by vertical market. That wasn't the question. It was about by region, geographically. It's driven by government right now, surprisingly, right? I mean, you don't often expect the government to drive innovation, but sometimes when the government simply removes a barrier, then innovation flourishes. And so a country like South Korea, they are adopting FIDO hand over fist. And that's because they already had a strong e-signature ecosystem, a PKI infrastructure that had government imposed, really strict technical requirements that grew outdated. And so they opened it up and said, all right, well, you can use something else to unlock our e-signature PKI infrastructure. And the industry kind of rushed to FIDO as that solution. So that's one example. And I think there are others in Europe with Payment Services Directive 2, putting in strong customer authentication as a new requirement, basically a multi-factor requirement. Well, FIDO's a nice fit there because you can do multi-factor with a single user gesture. So you don't have to add any friction to fulfill that requirement. So I think Europe's going to be a big driver over the next few years as well. Let me get to I'm going to consolidate a couple of these questions around privacy. So we really haven't talked about privacy at all. So the FIDO model, I don't think I said this explicitly yet, but I think it's inferred in everything you've heard today. The privacy model is device-centric. Like you do not authenticate using FIDO without a device, right? So the device is part of the presentation of secret. That's how you get the private key. The private key is minted on that device and it stays on that device. So you prove you're the right user to your device, then your device proves that it's the right device to the online service, and passing along any information that it needs to that service so the service can trust the assertion. So I got a few questions in here around privacy. One is, if the enterprise is using Fido authenticators, then what about the privacy requirements of Fido? Because Fido does have a few key points, and you can read more about the privacy principles, which are published on our website. But one key point is, if you're using a biometric, it's got to be device-side matching, not server-side matching. And the other is no tracking, no identifier. So there's a second question about, is there an embedded identifier with Fido authentication? And the answer is no. In fact, there's a requirement not to. The one thing that comes across is the attestation certificate. So this is how the device manufacturer is able to prove to the online service, I really am, let's say, a Galaxy S8. And you can verify it through the Fido metadata service and the attestation from the device. Attestation is becoming more commonplace. Google rolled out attestation for all Android devices this past year. So attestation is an important tool in everyone's authentication tool chain now. So that's one thing you get. A privacy requirement of Fido is that the attestation has to be in batches. And if I recall correctly, it has to be 100,000 or more. So that means that it's going to be the same attestation, certificate is going to be used across at least 100,000 devices. So you're not going to have one-to-one. You're not going to have a device attestation that's unique for every device, because that would be an identifier. That could be used as an identifier to track the use of that device across applications. So that was a key requirement very early on. 2013, we figured that out and made that a core requirement of everything we've done since. So I just wanted to answer some of those privacy questions. Al, just for you for a moment, did privacy ever come up in your research in the past year as a concern for the enterprise?
Well, I can tell you that privacy comes up as a concern not only within the enterprise, but certainly from the consumer side as well. And we've seen that for a number of years. We actually have done more kind of tracking of the notion of privacy ever since Edward Snowden. And so I can tell you it is much more of a concern. In fact, anything that has to do with digital and cyber and personal or comforting information, sensitivity has just generally been higher over the last few years. So it is a major concern. Thanks.
So we got some questions about certification. So is certification of these authenticators, these devices, required? Is it important for high assurance, a strong authentication mechanism? So let me just kind of give an update on what Fido Alliance is doing. Again, this is a Fido Alliance webinar, but the report covers every type of authentication. So Al can give you a more broad answer. I'll just speak to the Fido compliant mechanisms. So in Fido certification, up until recently, we've only tested that your authenticator conforms to the spec. You have to run it against our test tools, and that it interoperates. You have to go through some kind of plugfest type event and prove that you interoperate with a number of other independently developed solutions. However, in 2017, we have started to roll out, and soon we'll be announcing the first results of security certification testing. So we've been out there accrediting security labs to perform the security certification, and we have a number of levels. So several levels to this model. We're going to announce levels 1 and 2 to start with, and then there will be higher levels of security assessed, starting in 2018. The different levels of security testing only apply to authenticators. This is only device side, and what they're measuring is how well you protect the private key from attack. So all Fido authenticators are inherently protected from phishing, just the way the protocol works. If you've implemented the protocol, you've got that security checkbox. However, what we're looking at now is more of a malware attack. If I'm able to infect the client device, can I get my hands on the private key somehow? Can I get it out of shared memory space, for example? So all the different techniques that one can employ, trusted execution environments, secure elements, TPM chips, et cetera, and so forth, even code obfuscation and white box encryption. All of these are techniques that are used today to protect very sensitive secrets on devices. And we've come up with a layered level of security program that people can prove I'm using those techniques, and therefore private keys created on my device are safer from, basically they're safe from a broader set of potential attacks. Some deployments, some use cases care so much about this, they're looking at protection from physical attacks. They're not satisfied with the private key being safe from a malware infection from a remote attack. They also want to make sure that private key is protected from physical theft of the device, cracking it open, and using advanced techniques to try to get at the private key. So we have a full range, and all of that's going to become kind of part of our mainstream certification program next year. So looking at the time, this is probably our last question, but Al, I'm going to ask you to comment on it. What are you seeing, the role that certification plays? First, if you could comment on what Fido's doing, and if you think that's going to be relevant to the companies that you've interviewed. And then if you want to add anything about, other aspects of certification, even if it's beyond Fido.
And all in 60 seconds. No, so I do have just maybe a couple comments there. So, certainly the issue of protecting against physical theft is a considerable concern when you start thinking about the enterprise, probably more so than the customer space. But on the flip side, you start to consider that you have this kind of really broad base for businesses that are looking to authenticate their customers of individuals whose, security you are at you are at the whim of, right? You are wholly dependent as a business, or you at least are very much affected as a business by these millions and millions of consumers, billions of consumers, and how they protect, their individual devices, which means things like malware are a very real concern. And so being able to offer a higher degree, right, of certainty that sensitive information, that cryptographic key is being well protected in memory, for example, I think is really going to win some fans, to be sure. Now, this also gave me a thought about the research. We did not ask about audits in this research, so I think there's maybe an opportunity for us the next time around to do a little bit of that as well. So I'm looking forward to being able to talk about, how businesses anyway that are implying certain types of authentication did on, audits for things like PCI DSS, and if they've ever, been cited by an assessor, right, or fined. And so we're going to explore some of that too on kind of the flip side of the equation. But Brett, I think that's all I really have time for.
Right. Thank you, Al. And thank you, Al, for everything today. I can slip in one last answer. The question that I saw just come in is Fido Alliance hiring. If you go to find Fido Alliance on LinkedIn, and you'll see where there's a couple positions open, I think for Korea and Japan. We're also going to be hiring in China and India. So basically, we're broadening our investment to help these emerging markets find their way to Fido for the betterment of the global industry. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our organizers to close us out.
Excellent. Thank you, Brett and Al, for this informative and insightful presentation and discussion today. We encourage everyone to download the full report to access even more of this valuable research and related recommendations. Please also take a few moments to complete the survey at the end of this live webinar. We hope to connect with you all again soon, so please look for us on social media, on Twitter at Fido Alliance, and on LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us, and please visit fidoalliance.org for even more information about the Alliance and high assurance strong authentication. Thank you.